So it's a pleasure to be here. I will make a presentation that has its factual based on the assessments that have been done before by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and throw in a few facts from IPCC, but not so much, because I believe my participation here is to bring in the biodiversity and ecosystems angle. So it's a fact that Africa is abundant in the wealth of biodiversity and ecosystem services. And it is one of those natural resources that African Union in Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, has been identified in aspiration 1 of the Agenda 2063, that natural resources are key to the transformation of the continent. But if they are key to the transformation of the continent, it is self-defeating if these natural resources would not be available in the future. So we talk about sustainability. So Africa, of course, I will not read what is on the slides here, but just to realize that it is Africa is a unique continent with the diverse ecosystems and a wide range of biodiversity, but also most important is the knowledge on how the indigenous and local knowledge on how to manage nature, how to live in harmony with nature. This should also be taken into consideration as we talk about climate change, ecosystems and ecosystem services and biodiversity. This slide just shows you a snapshot. It's not comprehensive in any way, but it shows you wherever you go, east, north, west, south, central, the continent is overflowing, if so to speak, with abundance of natural resources. Next slide, please. But equally and most important to Africa, especially from the Convention on Combating Desertification, UNCCD, what has been noted is that Africa's land is equally highly degraded. About 20%, which is about 6.6 million square kilometers, is land that has been degraded. And therefore, it compromises the very foundation of nature and living in harmony with nature, the sustainability of ecosystems and ecosystem services and biodiversity is at risk because of this particular phenomenon that is widespread in the continent. And then in terms of climate change, I think this is, I'll just pass over this, that the temperatures in all African countries are rising faster than the global rates. When you look at the regional statistics from IPCC and others, and that since 1970s, droughts have been frequent and more severe, and they are resulting in more land degradation, but also degradation of ecosystem services, and consequently, the loss of species, both plant and animal species. It is estimated that by 2100, climate would have resulted in the loss of more than half of the African birds and mammal species, 20 to 30% decline in the productivity of Africa's lakes, and significant loss of African plant species. So this is just a snapshot of what the impacts of climate change portend for Africa. But when you look at it from other aspects, for example, in agriculture, Africa is dependent on agriculture and rain-fed agriculture. And whenever you have severe droughts and those things, we also talk about multiplicity of impacts, for example, food security, hunger and poverty, and things like that. And this slide here shows you that as a result of these drivers of change, climate change being an important one, perhaps even the leading one in Africa, But there are others. I must put a caveat here. It's not just climate change. For example, invasive alien species, we have issues with illegal trade in wild fauna and flora. There are problems with deforestation. So overall, this slide just shows you that there is a big, a high rate of loss of species, both plant and animal species on the continent. And therefore, it's a wake-up call that we need to take action. Otherwise, the sustainability will be compromised. Now, regarding policies on transboundary ecosystems and ecosystem services, first of all, I just want to bring us at par. I know most of us know this, but for the sake of those who do not, there are 4 categories of ecosystem services. And when we talk about ecosystem services, we are talking about the benefits that we get from nature. The first category, not really fast, but provisioning is one of the categories. Regulating services, cultural services, supporting services. I will show in the next slide what some examples of some of these services. These services were first brought to the fore in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment of 2000, where the assessment was conducted globally, and it shows that the ecosystems were on decline, and the services they provide were also being compromised as a result of different drivers of change, but mostly because of human activity. Next slide, please. So this slide is just giving you, I don't know if you can be able to see it clearly, but I mentioned about the categories of ecosystem services. When you look at supporting services, we include there photosynthesis, which is as a result of nature providing us with oxygen, for example. Soil formation and biodiversity, and also giving species, especially animal species, a habitat in which to live. But don't forget that even human beings have a habitat on planet Earth, and nature and ecosystem services play an important role in supporting our habitat as planet Earth. On provisioning, we'll talk about many services, especially goods and services that we get, such as fish for food, wood for construction, and such things. But also a pollination, a very key service in terms of food production, where without pollination, then we may not be able to get some foodstuffs. And in the regulating service, they include, for example, cultural ecosystem services are those that are related to our faiths, and also in terms of recreation, when you go to enjoy in the forest, a walk, a trail in the forest, bird watching. Those who like the coast, as you go to the coast, you get those some satisfaction, level of satisfaction that we get as a result of interacting with ecosystem services, with nature, sorry. This type of satisfaction is a better cultural ecosystems. Next slide, please. We can have a next slide, yes. So it's a fact that many ecosystems straddle across borders, and therefore the need to think collectively. Climate change is a fact, will continue to negatively impact on ecosystems, ecosystem services, and biodiversity. And therefore, policies aimed at regional cooperation must be given high importance as we go forward. Next slide, please. And it is usually a win-win situation when we address conservation of ecosystems. It is a win-win in terms of nature and sustainable natural resources, but also in terms of addressing climate change. We know that conservation of biodiversity and ecosystems enhances adaptive capacity and strengthens the resilience of communities, and therefore reducing their vulnerability to impacts of climate change. Measures such as protected areas, which is found in almost all countries in the world today, and most importantly in Africa, has contributed quite a bit in terms of carbon sequestration, but also in terms of having natural resources for livelihoods, like tourism, which is an important livelihood for many communities and economies on the continent. But there are efforts also that have been done which contribute to the recovery of some of the threatened species. And the relationship in terms of, if you address climate change, on the other hand, it will also contribute to alleviating the pressures on some species that are either on the verge of extinction or are threatened. Next slide, please. Now, one of the very important works that the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services was a scenario analysis that was done in 2018. And the result of this for Africa showed that there is need, on the left-hand side of this slide, there is need to have a common approach of the SDGs, the 2030 agenda of the UN, together with the Agenda 2063, but also with other regional agendas, like the Pan-African Action Agenda on Ecosystem Restoration, the Africa-wide strategy on combating illegal trade and exploitation in wild species of fauna and flora, and others that come into being. The Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework on disaster risk reduction, that this needs to be addressed in a holistic, integrated, and concerted way. If we do this, then there are certain analyses of scenarios that were developed. And just to give you a summary of them is that the most viable is what we call regional stability. In regional sustainability, what we say is that if the region, Africa region, cooperates and works together, this is the best scenario that will enable the win-win situation of addressing loss of biodiversity, maintenance of ecosystem services, and addressing climate change. We have to work together. Policies must be developed in such a way that they bring the countries together, either at a continental level or sub-regional level, like East African Community, the IGAD region, that we need to work together as a region. Unless we work together as a region, we will compromise. Let me give you an example. In East Africa, one of the things that has happened in the recent years is that Kenya had a moratorium on logging, on forests, on public forests. When this moratorium was implemented, there was a shift of demand for wood or timber. And the shift went to Uganda. Uganda became a casualty of the demand that was not being met by the supply from the Kenyan ecosystems. So the rate of degradation or the rate of deforestation in Uganda shot up. That means that if we act individually as member states of IGAD, it is not possible to address the issues around sustainability of ecosystems and ecosystem services. We must work together as a community. We must work together as a continent. And there specific ecosystems that straddle across borders. And these ones are even more important for the region, e.g. IGAD region, to be able to address this jointly by all the member states coming together and making a common policy that will be able to facilitate common action that addresses the challenges on those ecosystems. Local sustainability is, I mentioned in passing, is where you say, okay, Kenya, we want a moratorium on deforestation, and therefore we are going to make a law and we are going to enforce it. But Uganda does not. So you will have a false sense of security in Kenya, thinking that we have achieved it. But what has happened is that we have displaced the problem, and the problem is now being borne by our neighboring country. So this is very important. But local sustainability is where countries attempt to work in isolation without a concerted effort with their neighbors. And the policy reform is a scenario where we say, let's
Mr.
just...
Levis,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but you have 2 minutes left.
Thank you, I'm just finishing. Thank you very much. So the best scenario that we have is working together as a continent, working together as a sub-region, working together across boundaries, formulation of policies that contribute to our sustainability, bringing all the partners together so that we are working in tandem and to be able to address the crisis that we have faced in terms of biodiversity loss, degradation of ecosystems, and the loss of ecosystem services. Thank you very much.